The ocean was calm, too calm for war. October 25, 1944. The dawn of a day that would decide the fate of empires. Far across the Philippine Sea, the sun rose over a fleet of giants, the last strength of the Imperial Japanese Navy. At their center stood Yamato, the world's largest battleship, her steel armor gleaming like a blade drawn for the final strike. Upon her bridge, Admiral Takeo Kurita gazed toward the horizon. He had no illusions. Japan was dying. The Americans were closing in from every direction. But duty bound him, not to win, perhaps, but to fight, to uphold the spirit of the samurai until the very end. Ahead lay the waters of Leyte Gulf, and with them, destiny. Kurita's fleet carried the weight of 1,000 years of honor, of men raised to believe that death in battle was the purest truth of all. They would face an enemy of machines and deception, radar, aircraft, and endless firepower. But they sailed anyway. This was not just another battle. It was the twilight of an empire, the last breath of an ancient code colliding with the new age of war. And as the sun climbed over the Pacific, the sea waited, silent, endless, patient, for the last naval battle of the samurai to begin. Before dawn, the Japanese fleet moved through the San Bernardino Strait. The sea shimmered black under the stars, the engines beating like a war drum. Kurita stood silent, his thoughts heavy. The Americans had already destroyed Musashi, one of his great battleships, the day before. Still, he pressed on. His mission was clear: strike the American invasion fleet at Leyte and cut their supply lines. It was Japan's last chance to turn the tide. As the first light broke, lookouts spotted enemy ships. At first, Kurita believed he had found the main American fleet. In truth, fate had played a cruel trick. The ships ahead were not carriers and battleships, but tiny escort carriers and destroyers. Taffy 3. Only a handful of small ships stood between Kurita and victory. At 6:45 a.m., Yamato's massive guns thundered. Shells the size of cars screamed across the water, lifting geysers of fire and spray. The Americans, outnumbered and outgunned, began to flee, yet not one turned away from the fight. Their decks launched every aircraft they had, some without bombs, some without fuel, just to stall the oncoming storm. Above, the sky filled with chaos. Dive bombers screamed down through clouds of smoke. Machine guns rattled against steel armor that refused to break. And on the sea, 3 small destroyers turned toward the enemy. The Johnston, Hull, and Heermann, 3 fragile ships against a fleet of giants. Commander Ernest Evans of the Johnston gave the order, "We're going in." He knew it meant death, but retreat was not an option. Johnston charged headlong into the Japanese line, torpedoes slicing through the waves. A direct hit crippled the cruiser Kamana, tearing her bow apart. Yamato herself turned away to avoid another spread, the largest battleship in the world forced to retreat by a destroyer less than a tenth her size. Kurita could hardly believe his eyes. Tiny ships, burning, broken, yet attacking with impossible courage. He saw smoke, confusion, and flashes of fire everywhere, and in that chaos, he lost sight of the truth. He believed he was facing the main American fleet. American pilots, low on ammo and fuel, made pass after pass. One dived without weapons, just to draw enemy fire away from the men below. Others crashed into the sea when their fuel ran dry, still radioing updates as they fell. The courage of these men turned the tide. By 9 a.m., the Japanese formation had shattered. Yamato fired her final salvo, then turned away under orders to regroup. On the sea below, the Johnston lay dead in the water, her hull torn apart. Commander Evans ordered abandon ship, his voice steady even as flames engulfed the bridge. "Give 'em hell, boys," he shouted, and then he was gone, swallowed by the sea. The remaining American ships, bleeding and broken, refused to yield. Above them, their pilots reported a miracle: the Japanese are turning back. It was true. Admiral Kurita, convinced he had stumbled into a massive trap, ordered a retreat. The last great strike force of the Imperial Navy, 23 ships still afloat, turned away from certain victory and vanished into the mist. The men of Taffy 3 had done the impossible. They had faced death with nothing but courage, and saved the Pacific invasion. The sea grew still again. Only the wreckage remained, drifting under the morning sun. Oil fires burned quietly across the water, painting the waves in gold and black. Among the debris floated hundreds of American sailors, wounded but alive. They had held the line. For Kurita, there was no triumph. He returned through the same strait he had crossed that morning, his fleet battered and silent. No music, no flag raised high, only the whisper of the wind and the knowledge that Japan's naval power had ended. That night, aboard Yamato, Kurita sat alone in his cabin. He wrote one final entry in his log: engaged the enemy. Situation unclear, ordered withdrawal, a single line to describe the end of an era. He looked out at the endless dark sea, and perhaps, in that silence, he understood. Honor was no longer found in victory or defeat, but in the hearts of those who refused to break. At dawn, Yamato and her surviving escorts disappeared beyond the horizon. The Pacific was calm again, but beneath its waves lay the ghosts of warriors who had fought with everything they had. They were not conquerors nor victims, but men caught between the past and the future. The sea was quiet again, too quiet for what it had just seen. Hours had passed since the guns fell silent. The sky above Leyte had turned from smoke gray to the soft gold of dusk, as if the heavens themselves were trying to forget what had happened below. On the deck of the Yamato, Admiral Kurita remained motionless. The wind carried the faint smell of burning oil and salt, the ghosts of the battle drifting over the waves. Around him, sailors moved in silence, tending to the wounded, washing the blood from the decks, lowering tattered flags. No one spoke of victory. There was none to claim. Kurita's eyes were fixed on the western horizon. The world there was empty, only the fading light and the long shadow of his fleet stretching over the water. He thought of Musashi, lying somewhere beneath the Sibuyan Sea, and of the men who had gone down with her. He thought of Yamato, the pride of Japan, now retreating from an enemy she could have crushed, had the world still belonged to battleships and honor. But it no longer did. The age of the gun had ended. The age of the sky had begun. Inside the admiral's mind, silence grew heavy. His officers whispered, afraid to disturb him. He had followed his orders, engaged the enemy, done his duty, yet deep within, he felt something dying. It was not just pride or hope. It was the very idea that war could still be noble. In his cabin that night, he removed his gloves and laid them carefully on his desk. His hands trembled. He reached for the small portrait of his family, his wife, his 2 sons, faces frozen in time before the war swallowed everything. He whispered softly in Japanese, "I failed them, and yet, perhaps, I saved them." He could not know that his retreat had saved thousands of American lives, and in turn, spared what little remained of his own men. History would not call him a hero, but it would remember him as the man who turned back when the world demanded annihilation. Far from Yamato, the survivors of Taffy 3 floated among the wreckage. The sun had set, and the sea was cold. Dozens of men clung to debris, whispering prayers, their skin burned by oil and fire. Above them, the stars began to appear, the same stars that guided Kurita home. A pilot, barely 20, drifted on a piece of wing. He stared up at the night sky, his lips cracked and bleeding. He thought of the battle, the screaming engines, the sight of the giant battleships turning away. He didn't feel victorious. He just felt small, one human soul adrift in an ocean of endless war. Near him, another sailor whispered, "We stopped them. We actually stopped them." The words broke through the darkness like a spark of light. And somewhere far away, radio operators in Leyte picked up the signal that would become legend: the Japanese fleet is retreating. Somewhere in the vast Pacific, beneath miles of quiet water, the wrecks of Yamato, Musashi, Johnston, and Hull rest side by side. Steel and rust, enemies in life, now brothers in death. Above them, the currents drift endlessly, carrying whispers of the past, the songs of men who fought not for victory, but for honor, for duty, for each other. The ocean is vast, but it is not empty. It holds the memory of every battle, every soul that fell into its arms. It is both grave and guardian. And perhaps, if you stand on a silent shore and listen closely, you can still hear them. The echoes of engines, the roar of guns, and the quiet voice of Admiral Kurita whispering through the wind.